Okay, so welcome to Unit 4. Unless you are in the fall, there is no Unit 3. Unit 3 is the federally mandated Constitution Day that we do. But otherwise, we don't have technically a Unit 3. So, Unit 4, we're going to jump from where we were talking about scarcity and economic systems, and we're going to jump into Unit 4, which is on supply and demand and equilibrium. Now, how this relates is we're still dealing with the issue of scarcity. We are trying to have our needs and wants met, dealing with the issue of scarcity by obtaining goods and services. So one thing we're going to do is we're going to measure supply and demand. We're going to look at demand first. And when we talk about demand, we're talking about the desire to own something and the ability to pay for it. So you have to be willing and able to buy something, or else it's not demand, it's just want. Or maybe you have the money to buy something, but you don't want it, so you don't buy it. So the only way we can actually measure demand is we look at what is actually purchased. That's how we know people were willing and they were able to buy it, because they did. And so one of the things you need to know is what's called the law of demand. And this says that when prices go down, the quantity demanded for a good goes up. And if prices go up, the quantity demanded will go down. So if you look at the arrows, it makes sense. I mean, people want to buy things when they're on sale. That way their opportunity cost is lower. They're not giving up as much. So that's very important. The other term I want you to know here is the word quantity demanded. Make sure that that is the term you're using, and don't just say demand goes up. We're going to use the term demand to represent the entire demand curve. But really what we're talking about is the quantity. How much of a certain product will consumers buy when prices go down or when they go up? And that's really what we want to look at. So quantity, just the amount. Okay. When demand's happening, there's two different effects, and you need to look at this chart, the income effect and the substitution effect. So the income effect can be when someone's income has changed. Maybe you got a pay cut, bad economy. Or maybe just prices overall are going up, what we call inflation, and therefore you might be getting paid the exact same amount, but because of inflation, because prices are going up, it feels like you can't buy as much because you can't. Your dollar doesn't go as far. Your purchasing power is diminished or drops. And because of that effect, you're going to change what you do and don't buy, or what you do or don't demand. This will have an effect on the quantity that you will demand of certain products. Now, you will also try at the same time, and this is where the other effect comes in, the substitution effect, you will look for substitutes. So if the bag of your favorite chips goes up to $10 a bag, and you don't want to pay that, because the law of demand says when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, you would start looking for cheaper snacks, maybe other chip brands, or perhaps something completely different. And so this chart gives you kind of the idea. If you were consuming apples, for instance, and prices increase for apples, you're going to consume less apples, but you might also consume less of other goods if you're seeing prices across the board go up for all goods. Now, if the substitution effect's kicking in, you'll buy less apples, but you might look around for something cheaper as an alternative. Maybe oranges are cheaper that week or something, and you substitute it for that. You'll see that the consumption of other goods goes up, and you can see the blue arrow there. And then the combined effect, if both things are happening simultaneously, it's just a combination of these two. And same thing for a decrease. And so you can look at those and kind of get an idea of how will people react. We're wanting to see how people react to a change in price. And by people here, we're talking about consumers, the households from the circular flow model in the last unit. Now, a demand schedule is just simply a table. When you see the word schedule, I want you to think table. And so if we actually knew, for instance, in this example, the price of pizza all over town, okay, let's say in our market here in Katy or in Texas at large, we knew the different prices the pizza was being sold per slice at every pizza place, and we wrote all those prices down. Then we could also measure how many slices were being purchased at each price, and that you can see those there. Now you'll see that there's two different schedules here. There's an individual demand schedule and a market demand schedule. Individual schedule is the measurement of what one person would purchase, and a market demand schedule is what all the consumers in that particular market would purchase. Typically, we're going to look at a market demand schedule just because it gives us more data. Okay, but if you look at it, you'll see the law of demand is being applied there. Price of pizza is $1. It's pretty cheap. Let's look at the market demand schedule. 300 slices are being demanded, so the quantity is 300 slices. But when pizza prices increase, let's go all the way up to $6, you can see that the quantity being demanded decreases from 300 slices down to 50 slices. And so that's just the law of demand, and you can work that backwards or forwards depending on how prices are changing. Now, once you have things into a table, then what we're going to do is we're going to graphically demonstrate this in what we call a demand graph or a demand curve. And you can see that here. And these are the exact same prices. Let's look at the market demand curve, which goes with the market demand schedule there. So if you see the different prices here and the different quantities, they've actually plotted those points out. So at $6, 50 slices are demanded, and at $1, 300 slices are demanded. So if the price changes, let's say it goes from $1 a slice and you have 300 being demanded, but it raises up to $4 a slice, you can see that we're going to decrease the number of slices from 300 down to 150. Now, I said decrease, but as you notice, we are actually moving in the up direction on the curve. That can be a little misleading to some people, but know this: when I say increase or decrease, we are looking at the quantity down here, okay, on the x-axis. We are not looking at the direction that you might be moving on the curve or the line itself. Okay, and that's a very important distinction. The reason is with demand, just think of the law of demand. When prices go up, the quantity demanded goes the opposite way. It goes down. So you have an inverse negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. And that's why it's inverted here. It looks like we're moving up, but we're actually decreasing the quantity. Okay? And likewise, if it was $5 a slice and we demanded 100 slices, and then the price drops to $2 a slice, consumers would start to increase their demand. So even though it looks like I'm moving in the down direction, I'm actually increasing because we're moving further to the right on this axis and going to 250 slices being demanded. Okay. Now, one thing I do want to say about this, if you notice there's just one line here, this is a condition we're going to talk about here in a minute called ceteris paribus, which is a Latin phrase. It means all things held constant. And so the assumption on these graphs when you see one line is that price is the only thing changing, and therefore, because of the law of demand, when price changes, we just change the quantity. And the quantities are already known because we've already measured them by what people have bought according to those prices. Okay? Now, if price, so that's what I'm saying here. If price is the only thing changing, we're saying all things are held constant. But you can see now we have a shifting curve. On the first one, it shifts to the left. And on the second graph here, where there's an increase in demand, it shifts to the right. We're actually picking up the entire line. That means not just one quantity is changing, like when price was changing, but we're saying that every quantity demanded is changing, even though the prices over here might be the same. Okay? So what would this look like? Okay. Well, these are what we call non-price determinants. These are the things that could break that ceteris paribus, that assumption that all things are being held constant. So we call it non-price because these aren't related to the price changing. This is related to something besides price changing. Okay. So if your income changed, like we talked about before with the income effect or the substitution effect, you're going to not purchase the same quantity of goods. You might substitute and start buying more of goods. So if we were measuring the good you started buying, the cheaper good, what we call an inferior good, all of a sudden we're going to have an increase in quantity demanded at every single price, because if incomes, let's say, are going down because of inflation, you're going to see a lot of people being affected by that, and it's going to change what we originally had, so we're going to have to shift. Consumer expectations. This is always about the future, but we always graph what happens now. So if you expect, for instance, the price of gasoline to go up to $6 a gallon this weekend, okay, and you know it's, let's say, $2.50 right now, well, you're going to go out and buy right now. You're going to see an increase in the quantity being demanded at every price level, not because gas is so cheap right now. It's because we have an assumption, an expectation that it's going to be not cheap in the future. So when we graph that, we would actually shift the curve to the right because of our expectation. Now, our expectations can be wrong, and maybe gas prices don't go up next weekend, but we didn't know that. And so right now, we all reacted by going and filling up at the pump. And so we would measure that by shifting that curve to the right. Demographics, this could be ways of describing people. This could be age, this could be people's religious beliefs, it could be their ethnicity. Different statistics on people can change the demand for certain products. If more women are moving into an area, you might see more stores that seek to cater to that, and so then there'd be more of a demand for those products, and then therefore the suppliers would come in to try to fill that need. And then that kind of leads into the next one, which is a form of demographic, but because it's separate, we want to just talk about population size. If the entire population of Katy doubled, you're going to see an increase in the demand for various goods. Likewise, if something happened where the main businesses here were shutting down, or the industry was bad, the economy was bad for those businesses, you might see a lot of people moving out. And when that population size decreases, we would shift to the left. Consumer tastes and then advertising. Consumer tastes change. Someone might demand a lot of one good, but then it goes out of style. They stop buying that and they start buying whatever the new style is. Advertising. People tend to see a bump in demand on products that are advertised. So advertising can certainly influence our demand for products that has nothing to do with the price of the products. And then finally, the price of a related good. There's two types of related goods: substitutes and complements. Complements, you buy and use two goods together, like peanut butter and jelly. So if peanut butter was on sale, you might see an increase in demand for jelly because they're saving money on the peanut butter and they have more money to buy something that goes with it. Or in the case of a substitute good, think the substitution effect here. The price of steak might go up, and people that like steak that can't afford it might start saying, well, now I'm willing to buy chicken. And so we might see an increase in the demand for chicken that has nothing to do with the price of chicken. So these are different examples and would cause us to shift. So let's jump over to quantity supplied for a minute. So the law of supply, this is going to be looking at things from the business's perspective. You have to kind of put out of your mind what a consumer is going to do when you're just doing supply, because the way supply works, and you can see it here, is price increases, quantity being supplied increases. In other words, if the price, the thing that we're going to charge the customers, is increasing, that means we as a business can make more money. We're going to put more of our product on the store shelves and make it available for sale. That's what we mean by quantity supplied. If the price falls, we don't have as much incentive to sell at the low price. So what we'll do is we'll put out some product, but we'll hold back a lot as well and decrease our supply, because we want to kind of drive that price back up. And the less supply there is, and if we can get the demand going, we'll start to see that price go up, and then we'll supply more at that time. Okay. So just like demand, there's schedules, so we can actually track what quantity of goods is being made available for sale at each price. And you can see with pizza here, at $1 a slice, we're willing as businesses to across Katy or across Texas even to supply 1,000 slices per day. When it's $6 a slice, we're even more motivated. We'll supply 3,500. Now, if you're thinking at this point, we just learned in demand that when price goes up, the consumer is not going to purchase as much. You're correct, but you don't want to think about that right now. When you're thinking like a supplier, you're just motivated by the fact that you can make more money, because the higher the price, the easier it is to cover the cost of making that pizza, which you have to pay for up front out of your own pocket. So the price has to at least equal the cost of making goods. Now, one thing we didn't look at with demand, but it applies to demand as well. and that is elasticity. It's just the measure of how people will respond to a change in price. So with demand, in the book, you'll see that there's a calculation, and if you get, when you run the calculation, if you get an answer that is greater than 1, it means elastic. So with demand, we were talking about if the price changed, you're going to see that substitution effect. People are going to wildly stop buying one product when the price goes up, and they're going to look for substitutes. Inelastic is when the number in the formula is less than 1. And what that means when we talked about demand was maybe gasoline prices go up, but there's nothing else that runs your car, so you may hate the new price that's higher, but you're kind of stuck. You're inelastic, and you're going to buy it anyway. Unitary elastic just means there's not a noticeable change. The formula rendered an equation of 1, and that just is a change in what was being demanded is kind of the same as what was the change in the price was in terms of the percentages. So that's demand. Now, as we look at supply, we're going to say, okay, the elasticity of supply, how a producer reacts to a change in price. Well, if the price goes up, they really want to produce a whole lot more goods. But as you can see at the bottom, elasticity of supply is not like demand. It's always, for supply, inelastic in the short run. If iPhones shot up to $2,000 per phone, that's great for Apple. They would want to produce even more iPhones at that price. But the problem is it would take them a while to get them all through production. So you're not going to see a huge increase in supply. Producers who do services are always going to be a little bit more flexible and elastic than those who produce goods. So people that cut hair or give cab rides, for instance, might be able to increase the amount of product they provide in their service than, let's say, a hotel who can't produce 200 more rooms to take advantage of higher prices. They're kind of stuck with what they have already. So that'd be an example there. Now, as we go through these notes, then you need to start thinking about costs, which goes back to what we talked about with factors of production. So we're going to look especially at labor cost, but also the cost of capital goods and land, the natural resources. So a few things you need to know here: increasing marginal returns, diminishing marginal returns, negative marginal returns. And you can see this chart will kind of help give you a little bit of an example on that. Other cost you need to know: fixed cost, variable cost, and then total cost, which are those two things put together. And then marginal cost, the cost of producing one additional unit. And if we're thinking at the margin as a business, we might say, should we produce 100 more hamburgers per day if we're a restaurant based on customers coming in? And we'd have to weigh out the cost and the benefits and see what that would be. And that would be the marginal cost or the marginal benefits. And hopefully your benefits outweigh your costs, just like we spoke about in the last unit. So at that point, then businesses can decide the best way to maximize profits and how much output they really need. Because the goal here is profit. You got to cover your cost. Anything you make above your cost is profit, and that's the goal. But as long as you're covering your cost, you can survive as a business because you're paying all your labor costs, your paychecks, as well as your capital and your land cost and taxes and other things. Okay, and so here's some things you could kind of go through. So spend some time in the notes and in your textbook looking through some of these costs and changes in supply. And then just like in demand, we can graph it, and you can see here that we have curves that we basically take the information out of the schedule. Notice the supply curve, though, now goes up and to the right because of the positive relationship between when price increases and the quantity supplied also increases. Will also shift to the right if there's an overall increase in supply at every price level, so the quantity is increasing at every price. To the left if it's decreasing at every price. And what causes the changes there to ceteris paribus is also called non-price determinants, but they are different for supply, so you can see the list here. Especially cost of availability of an input, that's talking about land, labor, capital. Subsidy, which is a government payment to a business. A change in taxes, so if you have to pay more in taxes, you're going to supply less. If there's a change in the law or a regulation that you as a business have to follow, usually set by the government, but sometimes the company can change its own way of doing things. A change in technology. Better technology is better, will increase supply. If your technology breaks and you have less technology, it'll decrease it. If there's more competitors, there'll be more supply in the market. The global economy can have an effect, so if something happens overseas but it affects what you do here, maybe you get your raw materials from another country and they're having a war. Now you can't get as many materials, you would decrease supply. And then finally, just like consumer expectation, we have producer expectations about the future. So if you thought gas prices were going to go up to $6 a gallon and you're the gas company, you're excited for $6 a gallon. So you're not going to supply as much gas today at $2.50. Remember, we always graph what's happening today based on our expectations. So, and you can see that in the chart there. Okay, finally, we're going to put those two things together, and that's where equilibrium is. It's this place where supply and demand, quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal, and the price at which they are in balance. And you can see here, if we put those two schedules together for consumers, for the quantity they'll demand for pizza and the quantity that's being supplied at those prices, you can see that 200 and 200 are equal, and that's at $3 is the equilibrium price. Now, most of the time the market's in disequilibrium, and so it's always trying to adjust. So equilibrium would be right here where the two lines overlap. Here you have excess demand. If it was $2 a slice and we follow this dotted line, we hit the supply curve first, you can see they're supplying 150 slices. But if you continue out to the demand curve, the demand's high because that's a low price. It's lower than equilibrium. So 250 slices are being demanded. That's called excess demand. The way you solve that is you would raise the price. If you raise the price, quantity demanded will decrease and you'll move back towards equilibrium. If you increase the price, it makes the producers excited for profits, so they will increase production back towards equilibrium. And you'll try to meet as close as possible. Now, you could also overshoot that, but we'll talk about that in a second. Now, an example here of a price ceiling. It's where you have excess demand, but you're going to be in disequilibrium. So the government, for instance, put in a price ceiling for rent control back in the 70s in New York. And you can see they put the price at apartments so low, even though the market could actually afford to raise the price, that it gave a lot of disincentive to the producers. They didn't want to take care of the apartments because they weren't getting paid enough. So they just kind of let things go. When the government took that away, they were able to raise the prices and go back towards equilibrium. Now, price floors would be the opposite. This would be the government puts in a price for a good, like wages for labor, but you can't go below it. So let's say they've set the market rate at the current minimum wage of $7.25, but the market really for certain jobs should only be paying $6.60, as you see here on the graph. You're going to have a lot of people wanting work, but not enough jobs, and so you would see a decrease in jobs when those price floors are put in. So it's going to lead to a surplus of workers, but not enough jobs. So getting back to equilibrium, this is kind of the theory. Here's the example. You can study that. Now, when we put these two things together, we're still going to shift things, and you're going to have to go through, and we'll talk about graphing later. But you can see that we'll shift one of the two curves, and the curve we're shifting here is demand. So why we leave supply on there if it's a demand curve shift is supply allows us to see where equilibrium is, and so you can see the original equilibrium at A, and now it's at C. And so you'll see that if we were to take a line back to price, the actual equilibrium price is increasing. So it kind of gives us a sense of what's going to happen in the market, because if the market tries to get back towards equilibrium, what the equilibrium price does kind of determines what eventually the real actual price that we pay for goods as consumers will actually do eventually too. Alright, so why do we use a price-based system in the U.S.? You can read through this. There's really 4 reasons, and they're here. And then you can kind of see some of the criteria and why we have a thing called rationing when the market isn't allocating resources properly. Could be concert tickets, where you see scalpers or that kind of thing. So you'll have all those. Go through that, and if you have any questions, let me know.